Good morning, folks. Today we're going to be talking about the groovy counterculture movement.
So what exactly does the term counterculture mean? Well, according to the internet, the term is used to describe a way of life and set of attitudes opposed to or at variance with the prevailing social norm.
Of course, by this definition, there are many eras in U.S. history that this term could apply to.
We have the colonial Quakers and the Mormons during westward expansion, whose unorthodox religious beliefs set them apart from the rest of the country.
There's also the second wave of feminism during the mid-20th century, which introduced many Americans to a new way of perceiving gender equality.
However, we're not discussing any of those eras today, are we?
No, we're not. We're discussing the counterculture movement during the 1960s, a time when experimenting socially, physically, and emotionally was all the rage. Let's dive in.
In order to understand the counterculture movement completely, we have to establish a solid understanding of the years leading into it.
After the conclusion of World War II during the late 40s, America's economy began to stabilize. Families were purchasing new homes, living more comfortably, and the stereotype of the good old American teen began to develop.
With families no longer needing to send their young children off to war, America's young adults were finally able to experience the freedom that previous generations had not known.
Additionally, the need for teenagers to financially support their families was alleviated, and they were left with plenty of time for themselves.
With the world in the hands of this young generation, a new subculture was bound to develop. And develop it did.
Sometime around the mid-1960s, this new counterculture began to boom. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll took hold of high school and college students throughout many parts of the world, reaching as far as Western Europe and even Australia.
Teens started experimenting with various drugs such as marijuana and LSD, and also with each other. Because of increased access to contraceptives, people felt more liberated in terms of their bodies and relationships.
Products such as birth control led to a more casual attitude towards sex, and in turn, public nudity and living with the opposite gender outside of marriage became commonplace.
The culmination of these sentiments was the summer of 1967, also known as the Summer of Love. This was an event centered in San Francisco that promoted the ideas of free love, activism, and drug use. This was also where the phrase turn on, tune in, and drop out came to be, which became the motto of many dropouts as they were drawn towards the center of the counterculture movement.
Another significant aspect of the counterculture movement was the increase in political activism amongst the country's youth. College students began protesting against the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. The phrase, "make love, not war," resulted from the widespread anti-war ideals of this young generation.
Aside from political activism and social experimentation, music played a large part in the development of this new culture as well.
While previously categorized as white or black, young or old, the emergence of new subgenres shattered those norms. 1950s rock and roll began to morph into pop, folk, acoustic rock, and electronic music. The diversity of the population was reflected in the diversity of this new music.
Music became a way for female artists to become successful, for African American artists to become more popular in the mainstream, and for society as a whole to freely express themselves. Experimenting with new sounds and alternative instrumental arrangements allowed artists to grow and listeners to explore a wide spectrum of musical genres.
Artists realized how popular their music became, and thus the festival craze began amongst teens.
Now, these festivals weren't the Fireflies and Coachella as we all know and love today. Sure, they were big-name artists and thousands of adoring fans, but these festivals weren't so much about the fashion, and more about the peace, love, and flower power.
Arguably the most profound music event in history, Woodstock 1969 was the pop culture music event of the decade. People were coming from all over the country to experience 3 days of peace and music. Over 400,000 people attended this event.
Not wanting to disappoint their West Coast fans, artists planned another festival in California, the Alamo Free Concert. Security provided by Hells Angels proved ineffective, resulting in disruption, riots, and even death. Needless to say, this concert was not as successful as Woodstock, and in fact, it is credited with bringing an abrupt end to this peace-loving era.
The 1960s counterculture movement both challenged traditional ideals and unleashed a movement that reasserted the basic values of the youth. Young people rebelled against their parents' values and traditions. Teens began experimenting socially, physically, and sexually. Music became a platform for social and cultural changes. But the end of the 60s brought an end to this era and everything it stood for. These young rebels began to grow up and mature, and so did their ideals. I'm Emily.
And I'm Connor.
And this has been
Not Crash Course. Christ. I'm glad I didn't do that in the middle of something.